Okay, a very good evening to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our presentation today. We are very privileged to have a guest speaker who will take us through an exciting evening. Whenever I've organized these functions, we have always had the privilege of hosting her to come and speak to us. She's called Dr. Loice Natukunda. Maybe she will give us the proper pronunciation of her beautiful name. Loice, I think today you'll realize it's a bigger class. I would like to hand over to you to guide us through this today's discussion. So, Dr. Loice, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, for the privilege. He's just pronounced my names correctly, Loice Natukunda, and I work with the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. I teach research methods. I also teach human resource management related courses. And I think this is the third time I am visiting your school. Although I do not have a background of engineering, but I am passionate about research. It's nice to see you all, Faith, just to see your pictures. Faith, I can see Delic, Fortunate, Dennis, Christine, Joseph, Kamoga, there's Davis, Barbara, and Michael. So good evening to you all, and I would like to start by encouraging you to share with me your research ideas. So we are going to be talking about critical reading and writing, or being critical in our research projects. But before we do that, I would like to hear about your research ideas, your people from a different school altogether in engineering, and I would like to hear about projects. If you don't mind, I can just put it in the chat. Is that okay, ladies and gentlemen?
It will have to be okay.
Okay, so Davis, what's your research project about?
I am looking at the spatial variability of the effects of COVID-19 on property market.
So a variability?
Spatial variability.
Spatial variability. What's that like? What is spatial variability?
Spatial variability, I'm looking at how different areas were affected by COVID-19. For example, Kololo, Kawempe, and Machinde were not hit in the same percentages. So now what I'm looking at is quantifying the differences, how different areas were affected by the COVID-19.
That's interesting. Anybody else? Fortunate? Anthony, has everybody started working on their proposal?
Yes, they should have some basic ideas. So
okay, Fortunate, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Loice. My research is basically to do with cloud-based machine learning for estimating greenhouse gas emissions from biomass using artificially intelligent algorithm. It's basically an artificial intelligence-based project. So, well, we shall be developing algorithms in order to quantify the greenhouse gas emissions by first getting the carbon stock that will be estimated from the biomass, or we can look at the vegetation, the soils, then the organic matter, basically above ground and below ground biomass, plus the soil and then organic matter. Yeah, that's how we shall be estimating the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, so you want to give us a less carbon environment. What's your intention if, after you have estimated what's going to be your intention? What's the end result?
Okay, basically the reason as to why this research is being conducted is because we want to have an informed quantification. Okay, basically the truth is in Uganda we haven't had a definite quantification of the greenhouse gas emissions. And we also intend to come up with a greenhouse gas inventory for the whole country. So there was need to quantify.
Okay, so you're
Yeah.
planning to provide information for people working at reducing emissions in our country or in our city,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Christine, what's your project about?
Thank you, Dr. Loice. I'm looking at evaluating the use of Earth observation data for air quality monitoring within Kampala.
Okay, something similar to, almost similar to Fortunate's idea. Can we have a gentleman, Joseph Kamoga? Joseph, are you there? Okay, Joseph is not coming forth. Maybe shall we have Derek?
Thank you, Doctor. I'll be working on prediction of wildfire risk probability for Queen Elizabeth National Park.
Wildfire probability for Queen Elizabeth National Park.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to say that when we decide to do research, I says we are not inventing the wheel per se. Some other people have already done this kind of research. But what's happening with you as an individual is that you are not satisfied with the information that is available or the practice, the approach that we are using to handle an issue. So for example, if we are having a lot of interventions to having low carbon environment in Kampala, and you are from your desk, you're thinking, okay, we are approaching this problem, but we do not have sufficient information, we don't have sufficient data. So even though something is happening, you are uncomfortable about it. And this is an independent study. So I think Anthony did not impose projects on you. They just said, go and find a title. So it's an independent project. You will, in some cases, you can have teams working on a project, but I think for you, it's an individual project. So which means you have boldly said, even though work has been done around this area about wildfires, about carbon emission, about COVID, spatial variability of infection of COVID. We've had a lot of information around these things, but it's not sufficient or there's still a problem. And you as an individual, you have made this statement by deciding that this is the kind of study that you're going to make. So critical reading, critical thinking, and criticality in research is not criticizing what's already happening, but it's saying that there's more that can be done. We can add on the knowledge about this issue, or we can actually improve practice in the way this issue is being handled. So you are already being critical because you're not claiming that this is something novel, no one has ever done it. You're only saying that although we know some information to some extent, it's not sufficient. So you are from the start being critical. You're not criticizing, not that, you're only being critical. And now I'm going to show you the research cycle and how actually your critical muscle comes in at every stage of this cycle. My imagination is that you've already done a lot of research methods lectures and you have gone through the cycle for research. You know what happens in chapter 1 of your proposal. Maybe at this point, may I have some ideas? What happens in chapter 1 of your proposal? Anybody? Yes, Michael. Michael, please unmute again and tell us.
In chapter 1 of the proposal, you were supposed to talk about your topic, the objectives, research questions, the methodology, and then a bit of the literature review. So you are supposed to tell us about what you are going to do as your research, what you intend to achieve in the research, and the time frame you're going to achieve that particular agenda or the objectives. So basically,
Okay.
that's what happens in chapter 1.
Okay, thank you. There isn't a standard procedure, and maybe it varies from social sciences and life sciences, but Anthony, do you do some literature review in chapter 1 and methodology?
Essentially, chapter 1 should be your background, problem statement, objectives, research questions, probably justification, probably scope of your work. Then chapter 2 will be your literature review, and chapter 3 your methodology.
Thank you very much. Well, in chapter 3, rather chapter 1, you are trying to say that there is an issue here. The issue is maybe for fortunate, the decisions that are not well informed by data. We don't have evidence of the approaches that we are making to reduce carbon in the city. So there's this issue. You drum it up, you provide evidence for it, maybe with statistics, and then you say, okay, it's worth spending money and time, because research is very hard to do and it has a lot of investment going in, and so this is a big problem and this is really important. Probably it is affecting people's health, blah 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 blah. So you pull out the has happened before, what's happening in the country, and then you drum up the problem. So those are two important things in your chapter 1: the background of your study, but also the problem. What makes you actually pound the table about this issue? We need to see that it is important. What's the issue with the fires in the national park? Isn't that a good way of vegetation to spring up, destroying animals? How many, or if it is destroying property, what is the issue? So in chapter 1, this is what you tell the reader, but also you have to mention the purpose of your study. So this is why I was asking you, Fortunate, if you have this quantifying method or procedure, what is it for? What's the end purpose? Or what's the end aim? What's the intention? That's also key. You don't drum up the background and the problem, but also the purpose, which you break up into objectives, because the idea is usually very wide. You put all these wide ideas in sort of like a funnel, and then get just a few things drop out at. Otherwise, you don't want to have a huge scope that becomes so difficult for you to collect data on. So you have these, your objectives, which you probably turn into research questions, and you can go ahead and make some hypotheses, which are like guest answers to your research questions. But also you can properly define what your concepts are. You talk about a lot of things: carbon emission. What exactly is that? Spatial variability. What exactly is that? Because if, for example, you're talking about financial performance of your department, what would that be? Rather, if you're talking about performance of your department in 2021, what would that be? Would it be the number of students that have graduated? Would it be the number of projects? Would it be staff promotion? Would it be alumni with jobs? So you have to be very focused and define the concepts that you're doing with your research. And of course, when I'll now show you the cycle. Let's see. Anthony, would you kindly please give me rights to share my screen?
Yeah, should be okay now.
So at the start, when they asked you to find a topic, you went and observed things, and you can go and observe if you don't have a critical eye, for a researcher, you can just observe and describe. So, okay, the Archbishop of Uganda passed away. There are many people are paying tribute. Describe that if you're an observer. But if you're an observer and you've gone with the critical eye, which you have done in finding your research topic, you will find a problem. And in defining that problem, like I already mentioned, is that already we have studies, we have work, we have views about your research. But when you start to define the problem, then you're being critical of the existing status quo or approaches to how things are happening. So to observe and then define a problem, that's already being critical. And then, of course, you form some questions which you think that when they are answered, then you would be able to sort of shed some light about the problem and maybe later on find a solution. So this is how your chapter 1 is like. You have to tick these boxes. You have to show the reader that actually this is the issue. We have probably been comfortable with it, or we have tried to solve the problem, but we haven't solved it sufficiently. So there are these questions that need to be answered. In other words, at the end of chapter 1, actually, we have somewhere where we write justification of the study. So that shouldn't fall from heaven. I have seen some proposals. Students go to the library, find some proposals, and then somehow they copy the justification and change a few words and put it there. There's no standard justification. If your chapter 1 is written in a critical manner, to find the justification that comes from where you put the background of the issue, and then your problem, the way you defined the problem, and the questions that you have formulated, then you can justify your study based on that. So sometimes my internet is a bit unstable. When I break off, you are welcome to let me know so I can repeat what you didn't hear. But the conclusion about these first 3 stages is that when you're writing your justification and when you're writing your justification at the end and significancy, it should flow logically from what you have already written in the problem, in the purpose, and in the objectives. So in light of all this, this is the justification and the significance for this study. Okay, so I'll pause there and ask if there's any question or comment about being critical in chapter 1. You can actually talk to me and tell me what you have picked. What's the key thing you have picked from the last 15 minutes I've been talking? Charles, is there anything you have picked? Unfortunately, is unmuted, am I?
Yeah, yes, you've talked a lot, but okay, something small I could talk about is that you said we need to see the intention of the research in that the purpose has to come out through the problem statement and the justification. Yeah, and then the concept has to be properly defined. Yeah, that's the small thing I can talk about. Thank you.
That's not small at all. That's important. What you've just mentioned is that you need the logical flow for a critical writer of chapter 1. You need the logical flow of your ideas. So there's a background of the issue. And from that we have developed the problem, and which is the problem statement. And then there's a so what. We can see there's a problem, but then so what? And that comes out with your purpose, and that purpose is what you break down into your research objectives, ultimately your research questions, and you can go ahead and hypothesize, make informed guess of your research questions by developing hypotheses. And then you've also picked an important issue that the concepts that you're researching on should be clearly defined, or what we can actually display them in a visual display using a conceptual framework to show the relationship between the concepts that you're working on. Be very clear what are you actually working on. I don't know whether you use the approach of variables, so you clearly mark what are your independent variables and what are your dependent variables. But even then, what constructs are in there in your dependent variable, that's very key. So there's a logical flow, and when all that is done, you're able to give the justification study. The issues that you've been discussing. Anybody else who'd like about being critical in chat? Okay, so I think I was saying the logical flow of all the subsections, so that we can be able to see where the justification and the significance of the study is coming from. And I said thank you to Fortunate for picking those important issues. And now I'd like to give an opportunity to one more person to share what they could have picked from being critical in chapter 1. Else, or should I pick Joseph Kamoga?
Thank you so much, Doctor. What I've learned so far, that lots has been done on our topics, but we shouldn't criticize, but we should always be critical. And also working with the conceptual framework, that's always good to define the independent and then the dependent variables.
Okay, very good. The thing is that when you have a variable, two variables, they can be so wide. I mentioned the funnel approach where you put in the variables and pick what you would like to focus on, and so that you have specific constructs, because those are going to actually guide your methodology. They are going to guide the decisions that you make on data collection, because you know you cannot go to collect data on something that is not in your conceptual framework, for example. So you have to take good care of everything that the choices that you make in the first chapter. Your purpose is going to bring about your research objectives. The research objectives should be operationalized in your conceptual framework, and the code you put in the conceptual framework. So for example, what was his name? Was it Derek, who is going to look at fires? I don't know what exactly he's going to look at fires, but if it is about regularity of the fire, and that's the research question that he's looking at, or if it is going to be about the impact on finances, or if it is going to be about the impact on the biodiversity of the national park, or whatever it's going to be, because fires in the national park can have so many research questions around it. So if whatever your funnel brings out and you put it in your conceptual framework, and you've developed constructs, and you say, this is what I have conceptualized as fire, then that's what is going to inform your choices on methodology, so that you don't have things now start to fall from heaven. Then when your chapter 1 is sorted, and you must spend enough time and enough thinking on this, then you can go on to do chapter 2, which is investigating the known. And I already made a disclaimer that you can never, probably there are some things that are novel in this world, but you may have to work very hard to claim that what you're doing, we don't have any information about it. That is something that is from scratch. So this is why we are encouraged to read related literature and investigate it. So in doing the literature review, you may want to write this question down, that to what extent does existent literature answer my research question? So maybe I'll put it in the chat so you can get. Okay, everybody got that? Somebody has to.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
we got it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we got it.
I'm going to concentrate more about this. So at this stage, is where you've been critical in the first chapter, but I think being critical is more critical at this stage of literature review. And please remember again that you're not criticizing existent literature, but you're having this question at the back of your mind: to what extent is existent literature answering my research questions? This means that you cannot write existent literature by just describing it. Loice said that on carbon emissions. Anthony said that on carbon emission. Fortunate said that on carbon emission. That's not being critical. So you do literature review with a critical lens and ask this kind of question. So you've broken down your purpose in probably 3 objectives, and you have 2 or 3 questions, research questions, and you're also having these questions reflected in your conceptual framework. So you're looking at the constructs in your conceptual framework and what is written about them in the literature, so you can be able to critique it as you write your review. And usually most examiners, when they don't have enough time, what they do, they read your summary, the summary of your literature. So when you have sections in your literature review chapter, it's very helpful, at least for the examiner or the reviewer, to have a bit of a summary at the end to show. Usually you have to put there the key debates or the key discussions. So you say the key discussion about carbon emission in Uganda is the issue of lack of money to do the right thing, or importation of very old cars, but also the big discussion is about probably a lack of government commitment to reduce carbon emission in Kampala. So those are the 3 things that have come through the literature. And of course, you would have shown that in the discussion, but then you make that summary. And then, so if this is what is the debate about or the discussion about, what is the gap? What are they not actually handling? So you probably now say, okay, now we know about the discussion about carbon emission in Uganda has concentrated on old cars and lack of government commitment. And I don't remember what I said was the third, but we still lack something to do with the information-based or data-based decisions. Or we haven't seen, for example, higher institutions of learning coming up to give the data. We see the discussion about cars, but we don't see how many every year. Or we see a discussion about lack of government commitment, but what does that mean? We are not sure. So you give your own voice or your own analysis of the existing discussion, so that the reviewer or the examiner can see that you understood what already existed. And please don't say that the information about this is scanty or is not available, because now with even the internet, people can easily check, find out, and these articles or information will just pop up on their screen. So you need to prove that you have thoroughly analyzed what's there, and you can actually pinpoint to the gap. What are they missing? Which warranties your time to go to the field and spend all this time doing the research about. Okay, and so now I want to pause again and see whether I have communicated. So can I hear any comments about what I've said on literature review and being critical? By the way, at the end, you have a little summaries in between your chapter, but then at the end of this literature review chapter, you need a summary of the whole chapter. So you pick the key points, key discussions that are going on and what they are missing, and then tell the examiner that your study is going to contribute. There's this gap. I mentioned that when you're done with the little summaries in the section in your literature review, you need this chapter and they clearly point out and where the gaps are. You are welcome to put as many gaps as possible, but in the end, the reader of your proposal wants to see which particular gap you're going to work on in your study. Okay, we don't know how much or whether the government will ever be committed to having a carbon free environment in Kampala, but that's not the focus of this study. The focus of this study is going to be about this this particular. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, yes is a descriptive answer. Can I have a critical one? Why do you say yes? What was clear, and in what way was it clear?
There is something I needed clarification on. Yes, I've been collecting literature. I've been reading a lot of articles. I hadn't considered this aspect of critiquing the literature as I write. The literature review, we simply have to extract information from the articles, then paraphrase and then reference, then we stop there. That's what I was thinking. But now you're saying that we have to critique the literature. Do I have to add, when I identify the gap as I read, do I have to add in some ideas and incorporate them in so that the gap is filled? What do you mean by I should critique? Do I write them directly into the literature? And then the second one, you talked about having a summary of the whole literature. How do I summarize it, or where do I put it? At the end of the whole literature or at the beginning? I haven't seen that before. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good questions, 2 questions, but I would like to ask your colleagues to answer. So we start with the last one. Where do we put the summary of our critique? How do we incorporate the summary? Because it's a little bit being strategic and political. Like I mentioned to you, to be honest with you, most reviewers or examiners are likely not to read your whole chapter, the whole literature review. They will look at the research questions and then they will see whether you have actually, because we said that when you do research, you're not inventing the wheel. So we want to see, your examiners want to see whether you are conversant with the conversations that are already going on, the discussions that are going on, and what you make of them, and where you see the gap. So because they usually don't have the time, some who have a lot of interest in your study, or who are very religious in the way they do their things, they are likely to read and see how you're building your argument. But most, I think this is a correct assessment, but most are going to be reading your summary. Now the question is, how do we write this summary and where do we write it? How do we help our readers? Because writing critically is actually bearing in mind your reader. You know, you're not writing this thing for yourself or for the shelf in your department. You're writing it for the reader, someone who is going to examine you, or someone who is going to use it to write a publication or things like that. So, or the other students who are going to do the same work as you at a later stage, just like you're reading other people's dissertations now to be able to write yours. So you're not writing it for yourself, you're writing it for the reader. So where do we put the summary and how do we incorporate it in our literature review? Anybody? Brenda, please unmute your mic and okay, yeah, go on.
Thank you, Doctor. From the discussions that have been going on, that when you're structuring your literature review, you have different sections that you're looking at. So as per each section, you can have a summary, summarizing what you have maybe reviewed in that particular aspect. And then after all those sections, you can have a general conclusion, like where do you come in to fill in that gap? So you can have like sectional summaries and then a general summary, summarizing all like the researches that you have been reviewing and the studies that you have been evaluating. That's what I got from, okay, that's what I understand from for how like you're supposed to summarize your literature. Thank you.
So I mentioned that your writing has to have this coherent flow or logical flow, which means that if you have 3 questions, those 3 questions should be reflected by the constructs in your conceptual framework. And when you do literature review, somehow you should also pick those particular concepts. So which means that if you have 3 sections in your literature review, somehow the first section is tackling the first question, and at the end of that section, you're talking about what others have, the research they have done and the conclusions they have made, the discussion that is going on as far as your first question is concerned. And then at the end of that question, that section, you're able to say, okay, this is what has been discussed around this question. If it is about how much time it takes for fire to cover the whole park, then you say this is what the discussion has been about, the time it takes for the fire to finish the whole park. But this discussion lacks this kind of information, or we still are not aware of what happens if it is a rainy day, or when it is when it has been noticed early enough, or whatever your question is going to be. So you say, although we have this whole discussion about the time it takes for a fire to finish off a park, we still are not, this and that is still not. And I'm going to that you can ask in order to critique the literature. And then you get to the second question, and then you do literature about that, and you're asking to what extent do we have answers for this question? The existent discussion, to what extent does it contribute information that helps us? And sometimes you can find all the information, or sometimes you can find, and it's okay to mention that this question has been answered, but probably there's this issue maybe in the methodology that the researchers use. This is or it was in a park that is in northern Uganda, where it is usually very hot. But now the park I'm working with is Queen Elizabeth National Park. It's close to Rwenzori Mountain, and it usually rains. So even though we have all this information and these answers, we don't know whether it applies to Queen Elizabeth National Park. So you see how you are not just describing the research, but you are picking the issues in that research. And then the first question was about how isn't it enough to just summarize and paraphrase other people's work? Isn't that what we call literature review? Who has an answer to that? Sure, a gentleman has an answer.
Okay, the way I understand literature review is you look at the available literature about your topic, what has been done, what extent, and you pick out things that you see applying to your research. You find a way to summarize it, then you reference it. That's what I understand.
Okay, so you pick things in the literature that are relevant to your study and summarize and reference. Anybody else? David, have you said something? Oh, Pavin wants to say. Okay, Rita, go on.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. So I think when it comes to critiquing literature, I think it may go a little beyond about summarizing. I think it also brings in the aspect of comparison between different literature that someone is reading and finding out, for example, if you're going to use a certain kind of methodology, why are you using a certain kind of methodology? What are people saying about it? So I think in the literature review, you're bringing in some kind of comparison of why you are choosing a certain kind of methodology, if it has been approved, and if it has been critiqued, what did this person use, the person who critiqued it? I think that's what I would understand by critiquing the critical writing in a literature review. It's you bring in the different aspects of different literatures that you're reading and then come up with the best to use in your work.
That's a very excellent answer. I mentioned if you just summarize and reference, you're only being descriptive. Remember, it's literature review, not literature view. You don't just view the literature, you review. You give a second eye and see something beyond. Beyond. You know the concept of a nice bag. Usually, I think, let me show you. I'm going to stop sharing this, and we will dive into actually how can you review the literature. You think Fortunate and the gentleman that has just finished talking was talking about summarizing and just referencing. So I'll stop sharing this and go into exactly how we can actually reference, rather how we can actually critique literature. So if you just are my slides seen? New slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are.
So if you just summarize what others have written and just reference, oh, Loice talked about fire in in national parks and she said it kills animals. What you have just said is what you have just written is just the top or the tip of the iceberg. And yet, from that conclusion, if Loice said that fires kill animals, and maybe I may have also gone further and said that it's the female animals that are usually mostly affected. I've made that conclusion. And you've read my article and you just said that this is the claim that I make. You've only said a tip of the iceberg, and there are bigger things down there that are a foundation of my claim or of my conclusion. And you have only just described the literature, but you have not reviewed the literature. You've not reviewed my research. You've not looked at the basis of my conclusions. You have not related it to your research questions, and you have actually not done a review. So your examiners are going to be looking out for that. And so I would like to now go to what actually does it mean to be critical. First of all, we said it is not criticizing, because just as in the chapter 1 where you put everything in a funnel and remove just a few things and focused on them, it means that even the other researchers, the people that you're reading, were not exhaustive. So they didn't do everything, and you need to find out what actually they didn't do so that you can fill in that gap. This is why we do research. What does it mean to be critical? You're asking questions about the text or concept or claim that has been made. So if I have made a claim, they to ask certain questions about it. We are going to see what kind of questions that you would ask. So, and then it is also a discipline of not taking what we read on face value. It's this kind of discipline that you need to develop. If you're going to convince your examiners and actually even develop papers for publications from your research, you need to develop this muscle, that this discipline of not taking what you read on face value, but asking questions about it. And I want to go into writing because you also need to write critically. So as you read other people's work critically, you know that other people will also be reading your work critically. So you need to write critically and go through it very quickly. So when you're writing, you give sufficient grounds for your argument. So we mentioned that you write the background of the study, the problem statement. You need to give that sufficient grounds, maybe using data or using claims of from literature, but give sufficient grounds for whatever argument that you make. If you say this is a big problem, you need to tell us to what extent and why do you say that it's a big problem. So you apply ordered persuasion, you persuade your reader. This is why I said that things in your conceptual framework should not fall from heaven, but you should, there should be that. Again, your literature review is not just talking about carbon emissions and whatever you're talking about, or COVID in these areas. It should be something that is coming from your conceptual framework, for example, or from your research questions or from your objectives. So there's that logic or evidence. And so I have just mentioned that as you read other people's work, you engage the author. You don't just describe what they have said, fortunate. You engage the author. Okay, he's made this claim, but so what? And we are going to see how you can do that. And when you're writing your literature review, you bear them in mind, the reader. Your reader will be saying, okay, what kind of questions is this study addressing? What does the writer, which is you now, think about the discussions that are already there? And where do they think they are making a contribution? Which gap do they think they are making a contribution? So you bear in mind the kind of questions that your reader will be asking. I already told you, bear in mind that they do not read everything, they're likely to read your summary. I don't know if, fortunate, you are convinced that it's not enough to just summarize your literature.
Yes, I'm convinced. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Very good. Okay, so I am not going to go through why it is important, but now I'll go straight on how to be critical. But maybe before I show this slide, let me ask you questions. When you're reading literature, what kind of questions do you think you should ask? I think Rita mentioned that she would be checking what kind of methodology they used, how is it lacking, how can I modify it and have the best results. I think that's one way some of the questions that would ask. So the rest of you, what kind of questions do you think you would ask? How would?
Well, in some instances, you find there is more than one, should I call it a theoretical approach towards certain research. So sometimes you want to look at the inclination of an author and then relate it to other authors and what they think about the same subject matter. So in that way, you try to synthesize the theoretical background of that author and relate it to your own research. Then maybe later you make a comparison with the others, keeping in mind that you have to cite out the gaps each of them poses in relation to your research.
Brilliant. So you've said 2 points actually. So you look at the discussions between authors. Are there similarities? Do they have like the same standpoint, or do they divert? Do they contradict each other? So you compare. You ask questions. There's been a discussion about female animals being burnt by wildfires. But so and so mentions this, so and so mentions this. It's their arguments rhyme or they contradict each other, and they do not probably clarify this particular issue. So comparing authors is one way, but also the other important thing that you mentioned is how does this apply to my own study? So that's a very important question as well. How does this relate to my own issue that I am exploring? What does it speak to the questions that I am, or the question that I am posing in this study? Is there anything else we can ask about what we read? Any other questions? So we said we can ask about the methodology the author used, can ask questions about the relationship with other authors. We can also ask about applicability in our own study. Anything else?
Yes, concerning literature review, when you are doing literature review, you mainly want to find out, first of all, the concept the researcher is discussing. Then after identifying the concept, you try to look at the methodology, how they go about the concept and addressing the problem. So in doing that, you also, like I'd say that you compare with other researchers, what they did in a similar environment. So after that, you'll also look at, is the methodology applicable to my particular research that I'm doing? If it is applicable, you go ahead and criticize it and see if there are gaps you can identify. So after that, after identifying the methodology and then the applicability to your particular subject, you go ahead to critique it to see whether there are gaps, and then to see the suitability of that particular methodology to your research. So under literature review, you identify the problem that the researcher was investigating. Then you compare the different approaches that other researchers have come up with on that particular problem. Then from that, you come up with conclusions. Now, conclusions will come in your summary of whether you are going to go ahead to use that particular method. Now that will inform, because the methodology or the literature review must inform your methodology. So your literature review should guide you into identifying now the methodology that you are going to apply to a particular study. But that will be after critiquing the different methods that have been applied in that particular field that you're investigating. So that means you have to compare the different methods that have been applied in that particular subject, and then you come up with a best after identifying the particular gaps with the methods that have been being used. So the literature review helps you to get an ideal method that you can use in your study. So in summary, the literature review will guide you into identifying the method that you're going to use in your research. That's it.
Thank you very much. I liked most, you've said very, very good things, but what I liked most was about the concept that they've been studying. So we already mentioned that if we are studying, for example, performance of your department, you may put all the issues around performance in the department into a funnel and cause just a few to come out, maybe 3. It could be about how many first degrees we get annually, or it could be about the money, or it could be about the publications. So for you, you study performance of the department and you picked out just 3. Back and shake so you're actually shaking a funnel that has already been shaken, and people have done research on certain things, and they have used particular concepts. When they were writing they are drawing their conceptual framework, they gave certain constructs to their variables and defined those particular variables in a certain way. So your question is, okay, they talked about performance of a department, but the way they defined performance is not exactly the same way you have defined performance. And I think you have said most of the things on how to critique literature. So when you read an article, you want to see the research coverage, for example, in terms of time. Was this fire thing, was the fire thing, what somebody's writing about fire, was the study probably done many years ago when there was no climate change, and now we don't know what's happening? Or if we are talking about carbon emission, was this before lockdown when the cars were all over the place and children were going to school, and now we had industries shut down, and we are now doing research in the time when actually we've just come out of a season where we probably had less carbon emissions. So you check the write-up and see the coverage, the research coverage, or even the geographical coverage. It could have been in Brazil, or where they have lots and lots of forests. Probably the results wouldn't be the same if we are doing a study in Egypt where it's a desert. Or sometimes it can be about the demographical coverage. If you're dealing with looking at COVID in Naguru and COVID in Kawempe, maybe there are more older people in Naguru and less older people in Kawempe, or the population is bigger in Kawempe than in Naguru. So see if somebody has written about COVID and is written about COVID in Kawempe, it's probably not the same as COVID in Naguru. So the coverage is important. And then the conceptualization, I already mentioned, I think it's Michael who said that we need to see what kind of concepts did they use and how did they define those concepts. Were definitions short of what you're looking for, or did they define exactly in the same way? What kind of phrases did they use? Could those phrases have a different meaning? So that's another question that you can ask. And of course, all of you know about the methods of data collection. And you need to ask, to what extent did this affect the argument or the conclusion? Because the methods that you employ can actually affect the conclusion that you make. So if you're doing a study with children, for example, and you give them a questionnaire to fill, somebody makes conclusions about an issue, but actually they used a questionnaire to collect the data. That can be an issue. And I think you've also pointed out the issue of other authors' positions. What do the other authors say on the same subject? And then also coherence and logic. Of course, your examiners are going to be checking this question. Is there adequate justifications for the claims that they made? So they could have made claims. I could have made a claim that it's female animals that are affected by wildfires in the park, but where is the justification? Where's the evidence in my methods and in my analysis? Where is the evidence? And you pick that on the author's claim and say, okay, this is the claim that have been made, but there's no sufficient evidence or justification for this claim. And of course, relevance to your work is important. These are just a few of the questions that you can ask in your literature review. And now Anthony is in the meeting. I don't know if he has a comment about this, or if he wants to emphasize something.
Yes, I am here. And like you say, I always tell students that you are exploring the body of literature. Whenever I am going to a new place, I ask about it. I read about it. What is the weather? What are the accommodation options? Which are the nearest options? How can I access, say, the conference venue? You know, it's the sort of stuff that we're trying to do with our literature. What do we know about what we want to do? What are the different methods people have used? What are the data sources they have used? Yeah, so I'm just re-emphasizing sort of what we have on this slide and the importance of literature. Those who have the misfortune of coming to me as a student, we know that that's where I begin. What does the literature tell us? What are people saying? And what can we learn? What can we extract? And how does that guide us in formulating our methodology? Many students think literature review is this burden. So you come up with a methodology with no link to your literature. You have a chapter on literature, you have a chapter on whatever methodology, but I don't see how your methodology will accomplish your objectives. I don't see how your literature has influenced how you've chosen your methodology. So methodology, I mean, your literature is a very, very core component of your research. That's what I would like to add.
I spent the last 2 minutes talking to myself. It was muted. So yes, I agree with you, Anthony, and this is a skill that we can develop. The logical flow of our proposal with the methodology chapter that is not falling from heaven, but which we can see comes from your summary of the literature review and the gap that you have identified. If you've decided that you're going to focus on the frequency of fire in the national park, it means that if that's the issue that you think literature has not covered properly, then what method is going to be appropriate for you to actually study very well the frequency of fire in the national park. So you keep referring to that gap and say, okay, we found out this and that and that and that, but it was not clear. There's issues about the frequency of fire, and you can summarize them in your conceptual framework. So this issue 1, 2, 3 was not clear, and in light of this, this is the appropriate methodology that we are going to use, the methods and the people or the subjects that we are going to study in order for us to answer this particular question. So somebody said a story to emphasize how we need to clearly understand what has already been going on in research before we embark on our study. He said that somebody was living in the city and he was invited for the village meeting. So he arrived at the village meeting 3 hours late, and these villagers were not Africans, so they were keeping time. So they had discussions for 3 hours. So when he arrived, while in the city, he had these ideas in his head. And when he arrived at the meeting, what do you think would have been the wise thing for him to do? He found people had already been in a discussion for 3 hours. What's the wise thing for him to do before he says anything? So if you are living in, Barbara, if you're living in a city and you're invited for a village meeting and you get there late, but you have very many ideas, you are from the city, you are enlightened, and you get to the village meeting 3 hours late and the discussion has been going on, what's the wise thing for you to do?
You first apologize to them and then you get to know what they've been discussing before you share your ideas.
Exactly. So you need to find out. Now, we don't need to apologize to people who have written about our study, but we need to find out what the discussion has been before we get on the table. And then when you don't just listen to be informed of what they have said, you listen to analyze it and check whether your ideas which you had in the city are relevant, or if you could shape the ideas or where the gaps are. So it's the same thing with literature. You don't just listen to what other people have said and put it down, but you analyze it and synthesize it so that you can be able to see where the gaps are. And then you design the approach to solving the problem basing on those particular ideas. So I think our time is fast spent. This is a very wide subject, but I can give you this tip. You should not worry about the amount of time that you spend looking for literature. So when you get the right literature, then you have taken the first step to being successful. You can ask Google on how to effectively search for literature and on your study, and there are very many. Oh, I was saying that you can ask Google on how best to search for literature, how to be effective in finding literature, and spend time actually finding the right articles, the right journals to be able to read. Do not worry if you take a lot of time on that, because your writing is as good as your reading. If you just have shallow reading, you'll have shallow writing. That's a principle in writing research. Your writing is as good as your reading. So it's okay to spend a lot of time finding what to read and reading it thoroughly. So, software can help you to organize your thoughts. I don't know what software you use, Mendeley or Zotero or whatever. They all have the same principles. They can help you to organize your thoughts, and you should use them. If you're scared of them and you want to be to use the pen, you can also review your literature with your pen in your hand, and you need to indicate the article that you're reading. You don't have to put all the information there, but put something that will remind you, or the link to that article. and then pick what the main argument is. Usually an article has 1 or 2 arguments they are making. So pick that argument, and then in the so column is where you write your reflections, what you're critiquing of that article. You may critique the method, you may critique the phrases they have used, you may critique the coverage, the geographical coverage, you may, whatever you critique about that article, then you put it in the so column. And I think the software can give you an opportunity to make notes, and you can make notes about what you're critiquing. When you've done that thoroughly, this column is the one that will help you to write proper literature review, because you use these notes to write a coherent arguments and a coherent critique of the literature that you have read. So I think I will stop there, and let me see if I can find this website right now and I share it with you. So there's this website that is very, very helpful. You can go to Academic Phrasebook for other things, but this is a PDF that is also helpful, that can help you to actually critique literature and use, if you're critiquing a method, what kind of phrases would you use? If you're critiquing the concepts, if you're critiquing the coverage, if you're critiquing, they will give you ideas on how to do that and the kind of phrases that you can use. And probably in closing, what I would like you to remember from this talk is that your study, the concepts that you're studying, or the idea that you're studying, there's been research that has gone before you. And in a way, you're becoming bored and saying that even though we have these kinds of studies that have gone before, there's still something missing, and it's worth our attention. It's important, it is significant, and because it has this problem, there's this problem. I don't know whether there's any proposal that doesn't give a problem statement. So there's this problem, and you can put evidence for that. So bear in mind that the study that you're doing, some other people have done similar or related studies, but you're being critical by being so bold and saying you want to venture into that area. So in other words, you are saying we do not have sufficient information or ideas on practice concerning this issue. So from word go, since you have accepted to go into research, you have to wear a critical mind. And then the second important thing that you should bear in mind is the coherent flow of your writing, of your proposal. You cannot have disjointed sections in a chapter. Every section informs another section. There has to be that coherency, and it has to be logical. There has to be evidence that underpins your argument. If you have put their background and put their problem statement, there has to be evidence for what your arguments are. That's the second point that you should bear in mind. So these two issues, you're going into research because you're critical of what we already know or how we are already doing things. But secondly, you cannot have disjointed sections in your write-up and disjointed chapters. So the literature review has to be one that is following up chapter 1, which is your introduction that has objectives, background, problem statement, conceptual framework, and things like that. And like Anthony said, you cannot have a methodology that is falling from heaven. Your choices of methods, the choice of the area for study, the choice of your study objects or people or whatever it is, has to be informed by what you have found in the gap in literature. So in that way, you're writing critically and you're bearing in mind your reader so that they can be able to see where you're coming from and where you're going. I think I'm going to...
Thank you, Doctor.
Any question, Rose?
I would like to ask about the literature review. When you're discussing about the literature review, is it a must for someone to put a summary? That is one. End of literature review, we have to put a summary. So I was wondering, is it like a must and not put a summary? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, that's one question. Any other questions or even comments? You know, when you learn something, if you talk about it, it sinks deeper. Actually get into, I would encourage you to form groups, some discussion groups, and go and share the reflections that you have got from this topic, from this discussion. The more you talk about it, the deeper it goes, and the more you share about it, the deeper it goes, and people get different things from a session. So if you get into smaller groups, if we had the time, we would have gone into some breakout rooms for people to share their impressions. That makes the learning much, much better. So, okay, any other question or comment, Michael?
Thank you, Doctor. You talked about the conceptual framework. So I'm wondering, in our scientific research that we normally do, is it a must that you should have a conceptual framework, or you can die with it and then you define your variables within your objectives? And then the other thing is about the hypothesis. Is it also a must that you should have an hypothesis for each research?
Anthony, looks like you have students who are so keen at being obedient and following rules. The questions are, we must have a summary in the literature review. Must we have a conceptual framework? Must we have hypothesis? Yeah, do you have a military camp at your department, sir?
Not exactly.
Okay, so let me answer this. We said from the start also that this is an independent study, an independent project. You are an independent researcher. You chose the idea. Of course, I imagine there are guidelines that you have to follow, and it's important that you actually abide to those. But if you decide not to have a conceptual framework, then you need to be sure why you don't have it. And if it is your examiner is somebody who is very interested in conceptual frameworks, and there is the conceptual framework issue is not in your study. So it's important to write your research bearing in mind that you are an independent researcher. You have read very well. You have plausible evidence for your argument. I am not doing hypothesis because of this and that, or I am not doing a summary in my literature review because of that and that. The reason that I mentioned that a summary can be helpful was that most readers are likely not to read the whole chapter. That's a possibility. It's that they will not read the whole chapter, but you can help your reader by summarizing your literature review, especially in the middle, in the subsections. If you could give the extent to which the discussions have answered each of your questions, and then make a bigger summary at the end. That might be beneficial for you and for these things are not casting decisions, but also, yeah, you make your independent decisions, but also bear in mind the guidelines. Anthony, I think you give students guidelines of your school or department.
And they have also done research methods where many of these could have been discussed. And yeah, so I think as they continue the development of their dissertations, we shall have more opportunity to engage and discuss these concepts further.
So I don't know about engineering. You don't do a conceptual framework. I think I've seen dissertations from your department and they had
Yeah,
conceptual framework?
some, depending on the nature of the research, will have a well-defined conceptual framework, others may not. And also the hypothesis, some will have, some will not. Some people just put a hypothesis just because it should be there, but there is a science behind developing a hypothesis. It's not a pie in the sky. There's how you come up with a hypothesis and how you test it. Yeah, so all of these are possible ways of presenting your research. But as you've said, it's not cast in stone. We just need a justification for why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it.
So it's not a must. This is not a military camp or project. There are no musts. Okay, I think we've overshot over 7:30. It's been nice talking to you. Good luck in your projects. Thank you, Anthony. Oh, Derek has his hand up. What's itching you, Derek?
Yes, maybe one last question, Doctor. I do have a question about contradictory views. I mean, do you have any pointers on how, keeping in mind that we are not supposed to be biased, like how do we get a standpoint when we meet contradictory views? Different authors, same issue, but they have contradictory views.
Anthony, do you have something about that? I think the academic phrase bank would mention something about picking the contradiction, pick the contradiction, and then check how that informs your research. So what's the contradiction, and how does that inform your research? Or it could actually be a good ground for you to say there's a gap because we don't have an agreement on this issue. Yeah, but Anthony, do you have something to say about it?
I think you've captured it very well. And as usual, these are things to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. Depends what the contradiction is and how it impacts you on your work. And as you've said, that could form the basis for further research. But most importantly, as a scholar, you need to reflect that you are aware of these contradictions, of these debates, of these arguments, of these differences of opinion. And then ultimately, hopefully, your data will speak to inform your decision on your standpoint.
Very good. So don't fear to actually say there's a contradiction. It's not disrespectful to critique literature. So yeah, shall we end it here? It's been nice. They say that the one who digs on soft soil also goes back home. So it's been nice to talk to you, and good luck with your projects.
All right, thank you very much, Loice, for that wonderful presentation. I am hoping that we all have learned a thing or two, and I am hoping that we shall see this reflected in your work, the quality of your work, and your research. We shall have our final seminar tomorrow, and this will be face-to-face. So please, let's be here at 6 for another fruitful discussion. And thank you very much for coming in big numbers, for attending. Dr. Loice, thank you for always honoring our invitations, and we look forward to more interaction. Probably in second semester, when we're midway our work, we shall probably invite you for more guidance. At the moment, we are building up our proposals, trying to figure out where is ahead. And I am sure that this information that you've given us will help us improve our proposals and come up with more solid work. So with those few words, I would like to bring this to an end. Have a good evening, and let us touch base tomorrow.